Booksy, welcome back to my channel and welcome to the next in the series called A Closer Book. This is where I talk about 3 of my recent reads. Today the 3 books I'm talking about are a trilogy. These are the March books. They are the graphic memoirs of John Lewis. He's a famed civil rights activist and a current politician. He's now serving his 17th term as a Democratic representative for the state of Georgia. And in these books, he talks about his actions as a civil rights leader, but also those of many others who fought for a lot of the freedoms that we enjoy today. And so these books are a very startling representation of a lot of the history of African Americans in this country, as well as a debt that we owe to people who fought on our behalf. Covers of the March books are especially significant, and I will show you them. This is book 1. This is the front. This is the back. This is book 2. This is the front, and this is the back, and this is book 3, front and back. These are very significant scenes from the civil rights movement. Of course, this is the segregated lunch counter that people sat in to try to get desegregated, and that happened in 1960. And on the back, this is the Edmund Pettus Bridge. For book 2, we have the freedom fighters and the bus being bombed. And on the back, this is a picture, I think, of Jesus, a stained glass window. And this, I suppose, would be Jesus visiting the people who are being jailed for the revolution. And here we have this historic march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. And of course, the presidency when Barack Obama was installed. So yeah, these covers immediately call to mind the journey of African Americans in this country, from the racially segregated lunch counters and facilities to the protest, the freedom riders being bombed as they tried to just integrate blacks and whites sitting together, as well as people being gassed and beaten as they just tried to march over a bridge. It all culminates with Barack Obama being the first black president of the United States, and of course this is symbolized by the White House on the back of the 3rd book. But as entrancing as these covers are, for me it's a title that really encapsulates the movement. The fact that march is a present continuous verb, that it kind of suggests that we aren't finished marching, that the march still continues as we move past accomplishments and trail markers, as we continue down this long way to freedom, that freedom has not yet been fully accomplished, and so we don't stop marching. Full steam ahead, I suppose. The fact that John Lewis is still serving means that there's still work to be done. The fact that John Lewis's memoir is told in graphic format brings an especially profound component to the struggle that he describes and that the illustrator depicts. Here, the illustrator Nate Powell uses a combination of light versus dark shading to represent these nuanced differences in the book. And so he has light versus dark brush strokes, he has light versus dark background to show the different events that are happening. And so here we have scenes that have white background, as you normally have with graphic representations. And then you also have these very dark backgrounds sometimes. Well, that is more like a cloud, but like this one. And a lot of these scenes that have these dark backgrounds are examples of the nonviolent protests, as well as other very significant revolt scenes. But it also brings us into this stark black and white duality of the experiences that are being described by Lewis's and his co-author Andrew Aydin's words. So imagine that we have these white antagonists and they're shouting these racial slurs, but their words are being represented by black ink. Then we have, again, these white supremacists, and their profiles are drawn, and we see them saying hateful things to black people, but their profiles are hemmed in by more strokes of black ink. So I think the fact that we have this graphic representation, this memoir, that is showing this stark difference between black and white experience, but that it's also being represented by black and white ink on paper, I think really depicts that it is impossible for either black or white to live in isolation, and that we need each other in order to form the complete picture. I mean, this whole book is black and white. But as it relates to the books themselves, let's break them down. So book 1 starts off with a prologue scene that happens on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and we see the historic march. But the book itself properly begins with the inauguration of Barack Obama on January 20th, 2009, and John Lewis waking up and getting ready to attend the inauguration. On his way to the ceremony, he stops at his office and ends up greeting a woman and her 2 boys and starts telling his story to them. And so we get to relive his story as he shares it with these two young men. And I thought that was a clever way to segue back into the past. And we get a lot of that transition between the present time of 2009, as well as John Lewis's memories of his own childhood, as well as the significance of the day in 2009. So in connecting with these two young boys, Lewis shares a lot of his memories of his own childhood growing up on his parents' sharecropping farm in Alabama, his memories of his first road trip to the north where they had to bring their own food in the car because they couldn't stop at restaurants along the way because restaurants didn't serve Black people. And of being a boy preacher at age 16, writing a letter to Martin Luther King Jr., who inspired him, and getting a chance to meet the preacher himself, but it's the passive active sit-ins against these segregated lunch counters that really rounds off the rest of this book, and I think that's why it merits this cover. Book 2 details the freedom rides where both Black and white protesters sat together on these interstate buses, challenging the separation of races on public transportation. A lot of violent scenes in this one where Lewis describes and the artist visually represents a lot of the bombings and beatings and jailhouse experiences that went along with these freedom rides. Like, this is a scene, this is a jailhouse scene, bombings and guns. There's a lot of that in this book. This is where the graphic part of the graphic memoir name gets merited. But at the end, he also hints at some of the compromises that some of the revolution had to make. I think the quote isn't said until book 3, but there's a moment where he talks about living to fight another day. So you stand down today so you can come back tomorrow to fight again. But this one is really graphic. Not in words, of course, but just in the representation. A lot of the time that was being shown here. So maybe some of those graphic scenes were shown to kind of defend the compromises that were made in order to further the overall objectives. Book 3 is the triumphant conclusion of the story, but it gets much worse before it gets better, with violent retorts and even more beatings and even more killings and even more jailhouse experiences. Lewis describes disagreements and disunity that eventually arose in the SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and how at some point he had to decide whether or not his own personal beliefs still aligned with the beliefs of this group. And in this installment, he describes his struggle for the Black vote, his trip to Africa to show solidarity with African revolutionaries there, but also his alliances with Malcolm X as well as Martin Luther King Jr., and eventually some of their separation of beliefs. But again, we transition to Barack Obama's inauguration, as well as we get this sweet memory of Barack Obama signing one of his historic photos, signing it over to John Lewis, which is a note that says, "Because of you, John, Barack Obama." And I mean, I know about this from history, but it was really nice to see it represented in the book as well. I don't know where it is. I could find it later. There's some slightly awkward transitions in this book as we constantly step back and forth between light and dark. We're stepping out of the past in the 1960s into this present moment in 2009 to show the violence that was happening and the urgency of the situation in the 1960s, but also showing the triumphant moments of 2009 and what the inauguration of the first Black president meant to someone who had fought for Voting Rights Act to be passed in 1965. I mean, there is no level of measuring the significance of that moment, but some of the transitions felt a little bit stilted, as though we weren't sure that we wanted to step away from that moment into this one or vice versa. But it's almost warranted, the transitions. It's meaningful, and so it's warranted. And so because of the significance, because of the profundity of it, we almost excuse any awkwardness that might result. And so I really enjoyed reading these books. I gave them 4 stars because I'm not a huge graphic memoir consumer, but the story itself and the representation is definitely a 5-star read. I read copies from the library. You see my NYPL stamps on the back, but these are books that I think it will be important and interesting for everyone to read, but also maybe to own as a part of history. The fact that we have a person who has been an activist and a leader for so long, sharing his story, sharing his memories with us, makes it warrant anything that you spend for these books. The March Trilogy provides a really picturesque glimpse into the history of the African American struggle over the past 50 years, and Lewis represents it kind of like an archivist. The fact that he's been around for so much of it and is still able to share those experiences and still able to participate in the continuing struggle for equality, I mean, I think that just adds another level of significance, another level of interest to these books. In here, he describes his encounters with other famed civil rights activists, and he intersperses his monologue with lines from Negro spirituals and famed Black experience songs that have become like anthems over the years. And so he's not just telling us what he lived, but he's also encouraging others to participate in his story, history. I think that these are books that everyone should read, maybe for a better understanding or appreciation of the past and how better to act today so we can preserve those freedoms that a lot of people gave a lot of their life and liberty and freedoms in order to assure for us. And so these are the March books, the March Trilogy. I recommend them. If you haven't already read them, I recommend that you pick them up. I got these copies from the library, but these are books that I think you could own just so you could own a piece of history. So give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be back next time to tell you about 3 more books that I've read recently, and I'd love to chat with you about these and other books in the comments. So let's talk down there, and until next time, happy reading.